guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because it feels like a roundup many months in the making, because honestly, it is. As a book lover who does primarily read fantasy, I wanted to feature some newer fantasy releases and let y'all know if I think they're worth actually picking up. I'm basically the guinea pig in this scenario. We're officially halfway through the year and I have 7 newer fantasy releases that I personally really enjoyed. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I read at the early part of this year, and it absolutely knocked my socks off and also really reinforced a particular genre combination that I'm just truly obsessed with. The book I'm talking about is Empire of Exiles by Aaron M. Evans. The genre combination I'm talking about is like fantasy with mystery thriller. I just love when there's some sort of central whodunit at the heart of a book with politics and all different types of elements thrown in there too. And this multi-POV fantasy story has that in spades. This is the first book to a new series and I truly was floored by it. Set in a kingdom where about 50 years prior, there was an attempted overthrow of the government. However, though, many people have kind of long forgotten this. All of the power players have either been dealt with or have been imprisoned. But at the beginning of this book, though, a young scribe is sent to an archive to pick up a powerful object, and a series of murders begin to rock the city once again, kind of pointing in the direction again of some of these power players coming back into the picture. As I mentioned, this book houses 4 different character point of views, and you will love every single one of them. And I also really appreciate that every character is distinctly different and also kind of has a different skill set and mindset, meaning that each perspective is very, very fresh. They also have a rather large age range, which I also really appreciate too. This fantasy world is highly political, and it's basically set in a fantasy world where some type of evil creature has kind of destroyed most cities and civilizations, and everyone has sort of fled to this last remaining city, which has a large wall protecting everyone in it, resulting in a political situation that's rather complicated because there are lots of different perspectives on what type of government should be ruling this town, with lots of different people coming from all different types of places now living together in a very confined space. There's also a type of magic in this world presenting itself as kind of like topic specialists. There are people who basically can touch a type of material, copper, gold, ink, paper, you get the idea, and basically like deep dive within that particular item. This magic, though, is very complicated as people can become very obsessed with these particular materials, resulting in many people who have strong powers to work in a place called an archive, where they basically work together to catalog a variety of different items. At the beginning of this book, because of this series of murders that seemingly get more and more political with each occurrence, basically a bunch of characters come crashing into each other's lives, including a young woman who works within this archive who has magical powers, her boss who kind of oversees the entire archive, an investigator within the city itself, and then a young legal scribe who is just an assistant to powerful individuals who sort of gets wrapped up in all of this too. It's so interesting. The politics of this land are so complicated, and the reveals and just sort of trying to piece everything together will keep you hooked. The magic system in this is just very, very unique and works so well within the overall story. I loved the first one. The characters, the setting, the plot absolutely blew my mind. I can't wait for the second installment, but this was such a great pickup. I believe this is also a debut fantasy, so I can't wait to see where this author is going to take us next. Next up, I of course have to talk about The Adventures of Amina Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. Shannon Chakraborty is one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors, so obviously I was personally thrilled to pick up the first book to her new series. This is a seafaring delight. It's absolutely an adventure romp. It will entertain you from page 1 and, in my opinion, absolutely delivered on the hype and just the story itself. In the story, we follow our main character, Amina Sarafi, who is a very notorious older sea captain, and she is personally completely fine with retiring and her reclusive seaside town and just focusing on raising her daughter. But one day, a very wealthy woman who is also the mother of one of her previous crewmates comes knocking on her door, letting her know that her granddaughter has gone missing, and also offering Amina Sarafi a sum of money that she simply cannot refuse. From there, we watch Amina as she gets the old band back together, going out on one final seafaring adventure, getting wrapped up and having to overcome so many different obstacles and magical surprises that we would not expect. I loved this book so much. Structurally speaking, I love how this book is written. Amina Sarafi is notorious. She has a lot of stories swirling around her from her past, and the book itself is written like another one of those tales, something you would share over a fireside, if you know what I mean. To the characters in this book are so lovable and also really, really complex. And in general, I just really appreciate that the story centers experienced older individuals, especially within a fantasy story. It's funny and swashbuckling. It's like everything you would want within an adventure tale. I also really appreciate how the author combines like real historical influences with a magical setting. The author is a historian herself, and I really feel like she pulls in such interesting historical facts, creating such a lush landscape to kind of read a book in. I love Shannon Chakraborty's writing. This book was so much fun, so entertaining. I flew through it, and another fantastic newer fantasy release. Next up, we have a very romantic, dark, chilling fantasy adult debut, and that book is The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chakshi. As I mentioned, this is Roshni's adult fantasy debut, but of course she has written some fantastic middle grade and YA fantasy stories that I've also enjoyed. This book was a delight. It's also a type of like luscious, heavy on the lyrical writing. This type of vibe is something I personally always look out for when newer books are released. But this book is written like a dark, winding fairy tale, but there's a lot of role reversals and unexpected twists that the author includes within it. And the synopsis goes, once upon a time, a man who believes in fairy tales married a very beautiful woman named Indigo. He himself is a scholar of myths, and he was very quickly and easily sort of swept into Indigo's orbit, who is rich, beautiful, and mysterious. They very quickly fall in love, and Indigo agrees to marry him with one stipulation, and that is he must never ask about her past or like go digging into it in any way, shape, or form. It's very much set up like one of those classic ancient myths of like a beautiful siren coming to call and kind of pulling a man in, but has some very specific expectations for their union. It always has this sort of dangerous and violent undercurrent throughout the entire narrative. Of course, though, everything is turned upside down when Indigo is called back to her family home after the unexpected passing of her aunt. When they arrive, the bridegroom, as he is named for the entire course of this book, begins to learn more about Indigo's past, and obviously so do we. I love how this book was written. The writing was beautiful. I loved all the stylistic references that the author pulled into this particular book. It felt like a modern myth and fairy tale, and it was so delicious to read. Structurally too, you're flipping back and forth from the present and the past, reading from the bridegroom's point of view, but also reading from Indigo's best friend she had growing up. You're not quite sure how these storylines are going to intersect, but it will absolutely pull you in. And I just feel like the entire book itself was so entrancing, beautifully written, absolutely a delight of a book. I can't wait to read more books by Roshni. I hope she continues to write adult fantasy because I'm a huge fan. Next up, I have a cozy fantasy story that I personally really enjoyed, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This book has a lot of hype, and in my opinion, I do feel like it delivers on all the hype, especially if you're looking for a sweet, cozy, and romantic story. In the story, we're introduced to our main character, Emily Wilde, and she is one of the foremost experts in Fae and Fae lore. And at the beginning of this book, she's very, very close to finishing her like life's work of creating this encyclopedia, documenting a bunch of fairies and different Fae stories. So she is traveling to kind of one of the last locations she needs to get to, which is this remote village in a very cold and desolate location. However, though, shortly after arriving, she's having a difficult time getting the town to warm up to her. She sometimes struggles with social cues and kind of makes a few missteps upon arrival. And she's especially frustrated when her academic rival and co-worker Wendell arrives in town because he's very, very charismatic and very quickly gets everyone to sort of fall in love with him. But from there, they do begin to work together, and a larger Fae mystery surrounds the town, and they themselves grow closer. This book is just delightful for so many reasons. First and foremost, the romance and relationship that centers the story is just delightful. Wendell definitely gives like Hal vibes. He's capricious and vain, but also hilarious and charming. The rivalry that exists between him and Emily is completely one-sided, which I also feel like adds a lot of humor and just really fun situations to read and discover. I also feel like the romantic pacing between the two characters was great. This is definitely more of a charming romance-leaning book. It doesn't have a lot of steam, which is something I want to call out. Something else I really enjoyed about this book is that Fae and Fae lore always stays at the heart of this book. Emily never loses her passion, and honestly, the Fae world that the author is able to create was really well crafted. Clearly, she spent spent a lot of time on the fantasy element of this, which I wasn't necessarily expecting going in. There's lots of different fairy tales and stories that are told throughout the course of this book that are dark and interesting and also very referential to what is currently happening within the book itself. The central mystery and issue that is kind of taking hold of the town was one that was rather dark and also intriguing. This is the first book to another series, and I'm just excited to see what other adventures and fae situations these characters come across. But if you're looking for a cozy and endearing and easy fantasy read, this is a great one to check out. Next book I have to recommend is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, another fantasy book that I would say leans much more in the romance orientation, but still has a really interesting like fantasy plotline at the heart of it too. Divine Rivals follows our two main characters, Kit and Iris, two writers that are rivals of each other, and they work at the same newspaper. This book is set in a fantasy world where gods roam the earth. There used to be many gods, but after many wars between the different faction of gods, there's really only 5 left, and 2 of them in particular are waging war at this very moment. This war has stretched on for about a year, and it's creating a lot of conflict, obviously, as humans are being used as the main soldiers in this conflict. Both characters are kind of going through different trials and tribulations in their life. Iris in particular has a very difficult home life. Her brother having gone to war, she hasn't heard from him in months, and her mother also struggles from addiction. Iris is kind of looking for a way out, but is really focusing on her passion. As a way to sort of relieve stress, she's been writing letters to her brother that she sort of stuffed underneath her wardrobe, but these letters have magically disappeared and ended up in the room of her rival, Kit, and they, unbeknownst to each other, begin writing back and forth. I feel like this story really does a lot of things very successfully. First and foremost, the connection between the two main characters is one that will absolutely grip you. It's just so romantic. The letters that they're writing back and forth from each other, the intimacy and the rawness of their emotions within these letters, it's just going to grip you. Obviously, too, there's this level of dramatic irony between them two. As they get further and further along in their written relationship, one of them does not even realize what's going on and continues to treat the other as a rival. So there's just a lot of humor and unexpected like tension created from this situation. 2, the fantasy setting is fascinating. This sort of god mythos setting and the use of magic within this is really fascinating. This book reads kind of like a historical fiction story with contemporary issues and problems, all taking place more so in a fantasy world. It feels so much like our world and the stories that we've heard from the past, but with just a slight magical twist to them, which I just felt like worked so well. And lastly, I just loved how much the story centered writing and the passion of our two main characters. Throughout this entire book, you're constantly reading letters and articles being written by our main characters. Not only are they confronting their love from one another, they're also processing the trauma and the danger of a war that's also taking place, first far away from them, but then right in front of their eyes. I just really liked this book. It was really unexpected for me. Rebecca Ross's writing is beautiful, and I just appreciated sort of the mashup of genres within this tale. I just felt like it worked so well. If you love romantic, yearning, historical fiction books, this fantasy twist to that I feel like is something you would really enjoy. Next up, I also have to feature the new Brandon Sanderson release, which is Tress of the Emerald Sea. I have to say, this is probably one of my new favorite Brandon Sanderson books. Just the delight I had while reading the story was so unexpected. I loved it so much. This is a Cosmere novel, but I also feel like would be a great place to start if you haven't read a lot of Brandon Sanderson before. You can always come back to it and reread it once you have more Cosmere under your belt, because this book is just another delightful adventure romp story that is just so whimsical and fun. Brandon Sanderson himself kind of describes this book as the Princess Bride, but with Buttercup as the main character, and I feel like that is such a fitting description. In this story, we follow our main character, Tress, and Tress lives on an island with her family, and she's very, very happy there. She has a beloved, she enjoys her work, and in general, she's just very satisfied until one day her beloved is taken away on an unexpected journey, and she feels like it's up to her to basically go out and save him. Tress's island is surrounded by something called the Emerald Sea, and in this world, oceans are not comprised of water, but instead spores, and there are a bunch of different colors and types of spores, but basically once water comes in contact with them, they spontaneously combust in some type of creation, and it's very, very dangerous to cross the spore sea. But we follow Tress as she takes on this unexpected adventure, meet a variety of people along the way, including a talking rat as her companion. This book is just so fun. The adventures and the trials and tribulations that we watch Tress go through are just really interesting. The world and setting of this book is also very, very cool. It also has such whimsy and humor to it. It will just entertain you through and through. This, as much as a tale following Tress trying to find her beloved, is also much more a book about self-discovery and kind of coming into your own worth and power without actually having to change yourself, but more just recognizing yourself. It's a delightful book. I loved it. I had really unknown expectations going into this, and I was truly delighted. And the last book I'm going to feature for this video is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. Of all the books I am showing off today, this is definitely my least favorite of all of them. That being said, I still feel inclined to at least talk about it because it is such a beloved and hype release. A Day of Fallen Night is the prequel release set in the same world as Priory of the Orange Tree. Both of them are standalones and technically can be read in either order. Personally speaking, Priory of the Orange Tree is a book that I've read and didn't necessarily love. I just think it's a little bit overhyped. Predominantly, I feel like it is underdeveloped in its plot point of view, and I was just kind of let down by the ending. I do like the writing style and conceptually the world and all of the different kingdoms that Samantha Shannon has created in this world, but I just think the execution leaves a little bit to be desired. But let's talk about this book. It's set in the exact same world, basically a fantasy setting where in which there are these things called wrens, which are dragon-like creatures, and there's wrens of water and there's wrens of fire. And in this world, there's basically a prophecy that a very powerful fire-breathing wren, which has been trapped and in slumber for many, many generations, will one day release itself and wreak havoc on the world and kind of like destroy everything. As a result of this origin prophecy, different kingdoms have developed over the years and basically view wrens in different ways. Everyone hates fire-breathing wrens, but some kingdoms also hate all wrens, while some actually praise and worship water wrens as gods. So within both of these books in this series, we follow a variety of characters existing and living in these different kingdoms, kind of involved politically in different ways, but most of them have quite a bit of power, their relationship to this power, their relationship to wrens, and you kind of see them come into themselves and have to take on impossible forces. You get the idea. That's very much the setup to this one. And I will say in general, I did enjoy A Day of Fallen Night more than Priory. I feel like it had a lot more political world building, which I personally appreciated. And I also just feel like the setting is an interesting one. The same issues I had with Priory, I continue to have with this one. I just felt like there were some unnecessary storylines and the buildup in the end was again unsatisfying, which shouldn't be a surprise because these basically take place thousands of years between each other, but the prophecy stays consistent. And I feel like how she approached the end game of both books were very, very similar. I will say, if you loved Priory, there's likely a very large chance you're gonna love this book too. But I will also say, if you didn't love Priory, it might still be worth checking out because it is better, but I would say they're incredibly similar in style, so it might be one that you might want to skip. So it just kind of depends on your preference and if you've enjoyed this series previously, but I wouldn't say this knocked my socks off in a way that I was hoping personally. Alrighty guys, those are some newer fantasy releases that I think are worth the hype. Please let me know down below some recent fantasy releases that you've enjoyed, as I would love to know. And I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!